And thank you very much for joining us today. I think this is a very exciting panel. What we've got here, we have two speakers, one from Century Pacific, Giovanna Vera, and one from PCX, or Plastic Credit Exchange, Nanette Medved-Poe. I'll give you a bit more introduction in a second to both of them. But why I think this is so exciting is that in a year 2020 with nothing but bad news, these two ladies in the Philippines combined to bring some of the best news we've seen this year, which is that Century Pacific Group, one of the biggest, foremost consumer companies in the Philippines, managed to establish plastic neutrality by buying plastic credits from PCX. Now, I think there are many things we can talk about this, but the fact that this was done, that we have a Southeast Asian consumer company able to achieve plastic neutrality, is a really positive development. And so I want to talk to both of these ladies about how they manage this. So first of all, quick introduction. I will introduce Nanette first. Nanette Medved-Poe is the founder and chairwoman, pardon me, early morning, of the Plastic Credit Exchange. And it's a non-profit entity that offers businesses and consumers a simple and responsible way to be accountable for plastic. She's also chairwoman and president at Friends of Hope, as you can see behind her. We have Hope on our screens today. And together these companies are known as Hope, which is an impact company which produces both company branded and co-branded consumer goods. Now, as a quick reflection of her standing, Nanette recently received the NGO Leadership Award and Social Innovation Leadership Award from the Philippines Leadership Awards. So prior to this, she was also honored as one of Forbes Heroes of Philanthropy. So very honored that Nanette is joining us today. We also have with us Giovanna Vera from Century Pacific Group, where she is the head of investor relations, treasury and corporate finance. She established actually that whole business unit really for Century Pacific Group and has led it to become the best in the Philippines and one of the best in Asia of IR programs. Not just my opinion, it is my opinion, but it's also the opinion of the institutional investor as well. But she has also been at the forefront of establishing the environmental, social governance strategy for the listed companies in that group. Lastly, who am I to do this introduction? My name is Michael Gilmore. I come from Albizia Capital. Now, we're a fund management company that invests solely in consumer companies and solely in Southeast Asia. Now, that approach has always meant taking a very long-term and responsible outlook to our investments. So, for example, long before ESG was popular, we did not invest in palm oil plantations or tobacco companies, for example. However, with the emergence of ESG, and particularly the UN PRI, which we signed in 2017, we have been able to focus more on ESG and particularly on plastic waste reduction. That's why we're so happy to join this conference, as the consumer sector is, unfortunately, in ASEAN, responsible for contributing so much to global ocean plastic. So I think this panel can discuss a few things, and I'm really looking forward to what we discuss. I think we can ask four questions. First of all, we can ask, what do companies want? We can ask what providers want from those companies. We can then come back to asking what investors want from those companies as well. And then we can get into more interactive discussion about how these three needs can meet and the story of Century Pacific and PCX as to achieving those needs. I'm going to change the order a little bit because originally I put myself as starting with that discussion of what investors need. But what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to ask Giovanna to give you all a break from me talking and to talk about Century Pacific and what they looked to get from this move.
Yeah, no, so thanks for that, Michael. I think to your question on what do companies want in general, I'd like to think that companies want to ultimately do the right thing, right? If their intention is in the right place, they want to do the right thing by their people, by the planet. However, I think the challenge is that ultimately a business is still a business. It needs to deliver profits. It needs to deliver returns. Otherwise, there's nothing to do at all, right? There's no business at all to help with the planet, to help with the people. So I think ultimately what companies want, and obviously Century Pacific being part of that, is to sort of find that balance where we can do what's right, but at the same time meet ultimately our responsibility to our shareholders, and yourself included, Michael, right? And other stakeholders, when it comes to our responsibilities with our people, but also our responsibility to the planet, but ultimately as well meeting the profit and return objective, right? So I think for companies, I know it sounds cliche, but sort of that triple win solution, right? In terms of winning on the bottom line, winning with the planet, and ultimately winning with our consumers as well, right? And I think all those three things work in tandem. And for companies, if we can find solutions that allow us to do that, then ultimately I think that would meet our goals.
Excellent. Okay, good. And I think now a good opportunity, Nanette, for you to add how, when you're looking at companies and what do you want to see from your company as a solutions provider? Why did you set this up? And then, what are you looking for in clients that you can actually then work together?
Well, I set this up because I became acutely aware of the problem early on, specifically around plastic, and that's what we're talking about today, right? Because Hope started off as a bottled water business. Single-use plastic is clearly been in the headlines as a very big problem, especially now with COVID. And I wanted to make sure that we weren't in a business that was adding to the problem, right? And so I went about exploring ways that business can be part of a solution, right? I didn't want to wait for government to get their act together, or for the environmental groups to get militant enough that they outlawed plastic packaging or whatever. And so I really went about trying to find a market-based solution for what I was doing. I was ultimately successful. Announced it kind of on our little network in case I could assist anybody else who was trying to explore their path to sustainability, and wound up with a very enthusiastic reception, which gave birth to the plastic credit exchange, so that we could scale the impact of companies. And I think at the end of the day, and this doesn't just apply with PCX, but for Hope as a broader group, that we are hoping, a lot of hope there, we're hoping that we can demonstrate that business can be part of the solution, right? And this is one very concrete way that it can show it's part of the solution. It's very tangible. We've demonstrated that it is affordable. Consumers love it, investors love it, the government loves it, right? Environmental groups, at least the UNEP has given, said that this is a responsible way of doing things. And so, until we find a better way out of plastic, we thought that this would be a great way to deal with the problem at hand.
Yeah, perfect. I think it's such a good instruction as to how these have evolved. And I think what you're both saying there really lends into the way that we think at Albizia Capital. And that's, I'll put that in as the third element to this is from an investor's perspective. I think we recognize from a number of different angles. So first of all, our investment outlook is very long term. So, we don't want a world that's been devastated in 10, 20 years time. We have a very long-term investment horizon. That's no good for us as investors. Secondly, we're seeing much more demand from asset owners, from their clients, from the people with money. They also don't want that, surprisingly enough. So many of us do actually invest for our children that it is pointless for us to invest for our children in such a way that the world is degraded as a result. So I think many of us on our side of this discussion are coming at this saying we want something to be done. We need something to be done, but we must invest in such a way that this is possible. Now, to introduce a concept from the investing world, there's a lot of discussion at the moment that says, you have one camp that will keep saying that ESG investing works and outperforms all the time. And you have another camp that says, oh no, ESG doesn't, it underperforms all the time, because you've got companies that are doing, wasting money on concerns that don't drive the bottom line. We actually disagree with both views. I actually think that the goal here, and as Giovanna well knows, not just within the ESG perspective, we try and work as partners with our companies. And we see with ESG, environment and plastic particularly, we see an opportunity to say, can we help you? Is there something here that we can actually do to improve? Because we want, investing consumer companies, we want them to have the best reputation with investors, with their peer groups, and with their consumers. So for us, we see that area that there is the potential to compete on being a better environmental company as being very, very interesting to actually take a leadership role in being a better environmental steward. So we think that's the possibility there, that we can have better companies in our portfolio if we work with them in this way. And that's why I think I would like to maybe move on to the next question, which is this idea that there's a trade-off between expense and competition and the environment. And so for Giovanna, I mean, if your competitors aren't spending on this kind of activity, does that enable them to lower their prices or outcompete with you in other ways? And could you tell us what the competitive reaction has been to what you did earlier this year?
Yeah, I think, Michael, that's a common misconception, right? And a common barrier for many companies, again, especially like I mentioned earlier, where the profit motive is obviously there, right? Number one, and I think more acutely so in a country like the Philippines, right? Or any other emerging market where the reality is consumers' purchasing power, if you want scale, tends to be quite limited, right? So obviously that I understand sort of that common notion that to do this would cost money, it will affect sort of our bottom line, it will affect our price points, et cetera, et cetera. But at least in our experience, I think we are relatively early enough in our sustainability journey that we are still finding a number of win-win solutions, right? Where the trade-off that you had alluded to is not as acute, maybe perhaps further down the road, that is decisions we need to make. But I think for now, there are enough low-hanging fruits where it actually makes the decision relatively easier, right? And obviously we're talking about specifically plastic here. I think working with the plastic credit exchange is one of that great innovations, right? Where it's made it relatively easy and cost effective for companies like ourselves to deal with the plastic problem. I guess sort of advice, if you want to call it advice, is for companies who are thinking to do this, rather than worrying about making that trade-off, choosing between A or B and sort of stopping there, actually sort of explore. I think, again, there are a number of innovative solutions out there, a number of third parties that can help. And again, in our case, we found this great idea working with Plastic Credit Exchange to figure out the plastic problem without necessarily, quote unquote, breaking the bank, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And Annette, once Century Pacific had joined with this, I assume there were other companies Pacific, but it was probably one of the bigger early companies to with Plastic Credit Exchange. Have you seen other similar companies getting involved, coming to Plastic Credit Exchange, asking for solutions similar to Century Pacific?
Yes, absolutely. So we have seen, the Century Pacific, it was almost, I want to call it an experiment, because when I kind of came across this solution, I'm in a low margin business, water. So I figured if I could do it, I could try and convince others, but I'm also a small business, right? And so I wanted to test this out on, larger businesses, and Century happened to be, the company that we tested this on, because they have, they cater to the base of the pyramid. Of course, they they're highly interested in sustainability, but also have responsibility to investors with regards to profitability. So we thought this was a great place to kind of test our theory. Luckily, you know, it worked out well. And when companies started to see that this was possible, you know, not just with, you know, a small next generation brand like Hope, but with large, you know, very successful publicly listed, you know, companies, we then started to get interest across the board, especially from multinationals who have very public facing sustainability targets that they need to meet. They were very eager to understand how this solution might help them. And then of course you have all the mission driven brands out there who are also very excited. So we've seen across the board, not just in the Philippines, but regionally and you know, in developed markets like North America and the EU, excitement around using the platform to neutralize their footprints.
Excellent, excellent. You're not mentioning any names there. Is there any reason why?
I'm happy to do so. I just wasn't sure if I could. So yeah, so we
doesn't mind.
Yeah. Yes. So we were, you know, we targeted, and I'm not sure how happy they're going to be about this statement, but we took a look at kind of, you know, there are reports out there on who the folks are that contribute the most kind of plastic waste in the audits, right? And so we approached them because we were also very aware that they were eager to do something. You know, these guys aren't trying to do the wrong thing. To Giovanna's point, they would like to do the right thing, but they find it difficult. This is not their core competency, right? They're not sure how they can go about this. So we were able to sign up, you know, Nestle, Pepsi, Unilever, Mondelez, I think Colgate, Palmolive, the local folks. We have NutriAsia, we have Century. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think Wyeth is in there as well, and the list goes on and on. So those are the big guys, right, that people would be aware of. But like I said, there are a lot of these, you know, next generation brands, especially out of the US, that are very mission driven and are looking to add their neutrality into the effort.
That's excellent. Yeah, some of those names are, I mean, while Century Pacific is a big name to me, some of those names are bigger probably to some other people in the audience. So good to throw those in.
There are degrees of commitment.
Sorry?
There are degrees of commitment, right? So in the case of Century Pacific, they were, the reason why they're such a standout is because they very early on didn't say, oh, we're going to test plastic neutrality. They said, we are going to be plastic neutral, right? As all the brands across the entire company were not saying, okay, we're going to offset a few tons here and there. They said, we're actually going for neutrality. And that's a huge commitment, right? And so that's why they're a bit of a standout. Not a lot of the folks on the list I'm talking about are still in the early days of their commitment, and rightfully so, right? Because they're testing the waters, they're understanding, and they also have bosses. You know, these are regional offices, these are country offices, so they also have a hierarchy in which they need to get permission to do something that ambitious. Where in Century, you know, the leadership was able to quickly come up with a decision and just execute.
Yeah, I think, Michael, just to add on that, I think this whole idea of innovation, right? I think in Century Pacific's core business, we pride ourselves in innovating at our core business, right? Innovating products, innovating new ways of doing things at affordable prices. I think many of our breakthrough products are solutions to consumers when it comes to affordable nutrition, right? Finding a way through constraints to be able to service a specific product at a certain price. So the way we saw this problem, as well as other ESG problems, is no different from how we look at other business problems, right? Is okay, we have this issue. Yes, we have cost constraints, but we're not just going to back out of it just because of that, right? Let's find a way to innovate around that. And then again, working with Plastic Credit Exchange found this great solution.
Excellent. I'm going to move into the next question now, because I think it leads on very neatly to that. And I'm going to look at you with this one, Giovanna, again, because I think we've been talking about the intrinsic point to what we're doing, the doing good, and how we feel that as a person, how we feel that as an investor, a company, or a solutions provider. I want to ask you if you know the extrinsic reason, the public and consumers, and how you interact with the company, with how do you see this as another area to outcompete? Whether you can be greener than your competitors, and do you anticipate also, that's the positive, the potential stick in the equation is, of course, do you anticipate potential risk from governments of things like extended producer responsibility coming into play? And the further ahead you are of other companies, the better position you're in.
Sure. So maybe a few things there, Michael. So yeah, you're correct. I think definitely the motivation of our entire sustainability journey was really began intrinsic, right? With our shareholders, a lot of our stakeholders clamoring for this, our institutional investors such as yourselves. Century Pacific is still largely family owned. So there is that next generation, right, of potential owners that are part of that age group that really are concerned about these things. So that was a big motivation. Similarly, a lot of employees, right, coming in, growing management also coming from that age group, eventually going to rise up the ranks. Obviously, that was a big motivation. So sort of before answering your point on externalities, I just wanted to emphasize that, because I think what we found out in our ESG journey is for it to truly be sustainable. I mean, it's again a word thrown around quite a bit, but for this to truly be long lasting, I think that the motivation needs to come intrinsically, and sort of all other external benefits, I guess, if you want to put it that way, is almost like cherry on the sundae. So I think I just wanted to make that point first. But yeah, you're correct. I think the way we see this from an externalities point of view is it's, again, another risk management tool, right? In the same way that you have a tool to manage your financial risks, right? You have a framework to manage your operational risks. It's becoming such a big part of our lives now that this is again, if you're looking at a business from a long-term perspective, all these things with regard to our planet and with regard to the climate are real actual risks for a business, right? So just purely from a profit standpoint, just from purely a business operation standpoint, it makes a lot of sense, right? So that's number one. So yeah, if you're looking at risks from regulation point of view, in the Philippines, it's quite surprising. There was a regulation that just came out on coal-fired plants, right? I think we're all surprised that, which is great news, right? But that actually did come as a surprise that our government sort of came out and really sort of made that stance. So yes, I think we don't know exactly when, but regulation could go one way or another. And again, from a risk perspective, you want to be prepared to deal with that. Capital market pressures, which I'm sure you can talk about a lot. But again, we are publicly listed, and access to capital, that is something that we need to sort of anticipate. And I guess ultimately it's license to operate, right? And now more than ever, part of that broader license to operate involves these issues, right? So yeah, I guess that would be how we would look at these things.
Excellent. That all makes perfect sense. And Nanette, from your other companies that you're interacting with, do you see similar sort of balance of concerns? I mean, one of the questions I'm intrigued by is whether you see some companies that you think are, because one of the things we obviously want to avoid is greenwashing. So do you see companies trying to get enormous amounts of publicity for buying the tiniest fraction of a credit, or do you see most companies actually lining up in a similar way to Century?
Yeah, okay, so that's two different things. The short answer to that is yes, we do see that, but I think that's not necessarily motivated by something sinister, right? I think that a lot of that is highly reactionary. Let me just go back first before I touch on this. I want to go back to the question you were discussing with Giovanna and competition, right? So yes, we are seeing across the players we're talking to, of course, there is this competition, right? They're all trying to, on the one hand, deliver on the goals they've made very publicly for their global sustainability, right? But on the other hand, there's also we want to be seen as doing better than others. Now, I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. I think that this kind of competition is good because net it's better for the world, right? And when it comes to, does this then create pressure that the government legislates? I actually think that's very beneficial because it levels the playing field. At the moment, when you have a voluntary system, you have a whole bunch of free riders, right? And companies like Century or the other folks that I mentioned who are trying to do the right thing kind of are at a competitive disadvantage for doing the right thing. And you never want that to be the case, right? So I think that legislation is not necessarily bad. I think you just need to make sure that the language is such that it encourages innovation, it encourages companies to find solutions that make sense for the marketplace and doesn't drive them out of business, right? But I think that this is good competition, net for the. We're hoping that what is currently best practice becomes ordinary practice,
right,
at some point. So that's the quick answer to what you were asking about, Giovanna, from our point of view. Now, when you were saying that, greenwashing, again, I think it's very easy to think, especially the public doesn't have all the information. A lot of this can look terrible outsized publicity and greenwashing. But again, I think a lot of this is reactionary to the fact that they are trying to do the right thing, responding to the whole, reduce, reuse, recycle guidance, but not really understanding that the work they're doing does not solve the problem. And so much of what we're seeing is basically frantically, reacting to the complaints around plastic. But I'll give you an example. I won't name any names, but there are some companies who say, okay, by X date, we are going to make all of our packaging recyclable. On the surface, that sounds fantastic. But the truth is there is not a management system in place to actually recycle. So whether or not it's recycled is a completely different conversation, right? So yes, they may make it recyclable, but do we have that infrastructure to recycle it? The answer, especially in these emerging markets, is no, right? And so at least not at the scale at which it's coming out into the market. Or if they say, we're going to make all of our packaging biodegradable, well, that's all fine and well, but the point is it's only biodegradable in certain conditions for which many landfills don't meet, right? So I think they are trying desperately to do their part as a reaction to, to complaints from government and from the public. But I don't think it is actually a well thought out strategy. I think what we need is a solution set, and that the companies can plug into a solution set that has actually considered, whether or not we're solving the problem or we're just reacting to appease people, but not really getting to the goal is my point.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly valid point, because I think one of the things that I know from as an investor talking to companies, particularly obviously companies predominantly, about their plastics of uncertainty, a lack of information. As they read newspapers, they read online, and yet the information goes in tons of different directions. So it's very, very hard for them. And that's where I'd like to maybe step into next, Nanette, with you, is to talk about solutions provision. Because I think what we've discussed is this sort of internal desire to do things.
Yeah.
And then the things like certification, verification, steps, all of these elements to which a company may have doubts about how to move along those lines. Yeah. Are these areas that that PCX is exploring or has developed, and where do you see it going from here?
Well, in the case of PCX, because I approach this from a brand point of view, right? I was a brand and I asked myself, what are the things that I would want from a service provider? And that's how we kind of backed into the solution we have, which tends to make it very brand friendly, right? So we provide a full suite of solutions to companies, which they can choose a la carte, from, helping them assess their footprints. We work with audit partners to make sure that they can validate those. And those footprints are great in helping them inform their, reduction capabilities, if there are any. We help them get verified through, auditors. We execute on all of the offset requirements. And sometimes certain companies say, well, I want all of our offsets to be ocean plastic, or we want it to be, community, women driven, or whatever. So we have that capability, all the way to registering the offsets on our global ledger, which is in the process of being blockchain protected. And then we do eco-labeling, which helps facilitate responsible consumption, so that the public understands which brands are actually doing the right thing, right? So we kind of offer a full suite of solutions to companies who are interested to explore how they can be responsible with their plastic footprints, until there is a better solution for plastic.
Yeah. Okay. And Giovanna, from your side, because you came into this, I mean, it was earlier in the evolution of PCX when you started working with them, I believe. So how much of this did you have to do yourself? How did you go about doing that in terms of working out what you were going to do first, and how you would actually verify your plastic, estimate, footprint it, and then validate what you'd actually done? How did you work on all of those steps as a company?
Sure. No, I guess, yeah, from taking maybe a step back from that, I think the first thing a company should do is, first of all, assess, is this issue material to them, right? I mean, there are so many environmental and social issues that companies have to deal with. And I guess step one is to really make, and it's to each his own, right? To make that assessment, whether plastic or not is something that is material to them, and is something that that company is passionate about solving, right? So in our case, we went through that entire materiality process, created a sustainability framework around what we call our 3 Ps, protein, planet, and people. And specific to planet, we did identify plastic to be one of those things that we thought is critical to us. We have a fast-growing milk business, where a lot of this milk products are in sachet formats. Again, in an emerging market where consumer product cost is a concern for consumers, right? As Nanette pointed out, until there's a alternative solution to plastic, the reality is that is a very affordable format for consumers. And we had identified our milk business as a strategic priority. We have all these 5-year growth plans to grow that business. So obviously, from an impacts point of view, the impact on the plastic side will grow alongside that business, right? So that was a big driver. Second is sort of this connection with the oceans. Again, a big part of our business is marine based. So it sort of hit us in 2 angles in our business. And then finally, just sort of, I think from a internal perspective and employees and management knowing about the plastic problem, it's widely talked about, it's easy to understand, right? This was also part of our decision making, because ultimately these are the people who are going to do everything that you just mentioned, Michael, right? Set up the systems, do the verifying. So if they're not on board and they don't understand why this is an issue, that's just going to be another job that you're going to give to people, right? So I think the good thing about this plastic problem, it hit all of those things. And that's sort of why we said, okay, that's going to be sort of a critical issue under our planet bucket. So how did we go about doing it? Again, I think Nanette described it quite well earlier, that we were almost, I think it was co-developing it, right? Sort of working together, really being sort of a guinea pig almost, and then giving feedback to them. And then eventually working out a system that I think does very well, is quite effective. But yes, ultimately, I think companies should be willing to experiment. I think Nanette does a great job providing this a la carte, as she calls it, but ultimately you also sort of need to work closely to sort of tweak it and almost customize it in a way that would work for your own organization.
Excellent. I'm going to move towards what is my last scripted question. I'll ask you first, Giovanna, because I think what we're talking about in this panel is we are looking at we're talking about footsteps, because this is, I think, any company that is not doing anything about recycling or bringing back in its plastic or any move along that at all sees this solution of there being a full circular economy and thinks they can never get there. And that impossibility is always the biggest barrier to starting anything. And I think one of the things that I want to talk about on this is those footsteps, that first, second, third footstep. We've discussed I assume your first and second footsteps, but I don't assume that you're last on this program.
Right.
And so what do you have planned as sort of the next stage for you on plastics at Century Pacific, or in any other recycling area, if you want to discuss that? And what can you imagine it going to? Sort of where is your sort of super long-term goal for that?
Right. No. Yeah. So I guess ultimately, sort of going back to working around constraints, right? I mean, again, the reality is this form of packaging is the most affordable form of packaging, but as innovations sort of come out moving forward, then we want to be at the forefront of all of that, right? I think the great thing about sustainability is in sustainable solutions, I think it's very early days. I think there's so much innovation potential moving forward. And I think the good thing is internally, top management, culturally, we are in a position to try out a lot of things. Sort of, I know, agile way of working, right? Again, it's another one of those buzzwords that we use a lot at our core business, but it very easily applies to this as well. I think I liked how you described it, Michael, that it's footsteps, right? I think the great thing about being plastic neutral early on is that idea of small wins, right? I think we are firm believers that, again, the sustainability journey needs to really come from the inside. It involves people, it involves work, it involves time on top of everyone's day-to-day roles. So if people aren't on board, then those things can easily fall by the wayside, right? So I think what's great about what we've done with plastic neutrality is I think it's rallied the organization. It's given it a little bit of a push that, hey, we've done this. We can claim that we are up front in the line. I think to that point earlier, we're discussing about peers and competition. I completely agree with Nanette. This is something that we actually celebrate when we see some of our peers, Pepsi, Nestle, and the like, doing this. It's something we are actually proud of as well, right? Because we can sort of say, okay, we were in the front of the line, and now look at sort of the change that's happening. And you can imagine the kind of excitement that gives the org, right? So yeah, I think there are a number of other things. Again, Nanette has a lot of things up her sleeve. And we're happy to, we're raising our hands to sort of take that journey alongside her.
Excellent. I've realized that we're into this presentation for a while, Nanette, and at no point have we actually discussed one of the main things your project does, which is it's the end of life plastic is has been the starting point and a very big part of what you do. I'd like to also maybe a little bit of an explanation of why you started there, so going backwards a little bit, but I think to also explain or to discuss whether you're also looking at other projects that would move further up the value chain or broaden out the impact of what you're doing, because let's hope that at some point you're taking all the end-of-life plastics out of the system in the Philippines, and you need another project. So where would you go next?
From your mouth to God's ears, right? Yeah, so, of course, that's the aspiration, right? Is that we are able to make a significant difference in making sure that end-of-life plastic does not wind up in nature, right? That's the huge thing. But this is version 1.0. These are, to Giovanna's point, these are early days in this space, and PCX is evolving daily, or weekly, as the space evolves. So we constantly iterate for things we learn from our partners, for offset buyers, as well as environmental groups, as well as multilateral agencies, right? We are constantly iterating, and we hope that beyond helping the Philippines with its plastic issues, we'd really love to be able to grow our impact geography, perhaps growing out country offices, not just so that companies, because many of the companies we deal with are multinationals and would love to have this solution, in other markets as well, and they'd love to geolocate, we'd like to be able to do that for them, but also in order to expand or diversify our processing options, which at the moment are very limited in the Philippines. We don't have high-level infrastructure here to be able to offer our partners, a variety of processing options. So we would love to be able to do that. In the long run, in version 5.0, I'm hoping that we become a very reliable, market-based partner, which facilitates the entry of higher level infrastructure in developing markets. And right now, the good news is that brands in developed markets, and I alluded to this earlier, understand that the epicenter of the plastic problem is in Asia. It's in our neck of the world. And they don't mind being geographically agnostic with their credits, which then helps developed country money funnel into helping developing countries build waste infrastructure, inject income into the poorest communities, and clean up the planet.
Yeah, very good. I absolutely agree. And I think all of those, I think what's so important is that you are anticipating the next steps, right? Because I think that is something that, it's all good businesses do it, all good corporations do this. What is the next step? Where will we need to be? Because I think that's an element with, there's a combination of where consumers are at is changing all the time. And so what your consumers expect of you as a company will change, but also what governments want will also change regularly. So it's very, very important that you're innovating ahead of that. And that from our perspective, to go back to what we wanted to discuss in this talk was, what do investors want, what do businesses want, and what the solutions providers. From an investor perspective, that's so important for us to see our companies not lagging behind on any area, whether it's advancements in food or in market, or profitability is always a good one, but also in terms of the environment and how all stakeholders consider that element. I have one question in the chat room. I'm going to discuss two of the other things first, because we have two compliments and one question, which I think is a very good ratio. So someone called Net Your Problem just want to say thank you so much to Plastic Credit Exchange for offering a platform. And to enable people like Century Pacific, and there's a LinkedIn link for you to contact them. Anna Verona of Clean Our Oceans Project is also commending Nanette on your approach on plastic waste management, and Century Pacific on rethinking and redesigning to do this. So two very strong commendments there. There is also a question though, which is we need help from the national government to encourage redesigning to move forward. Is there a project or a movement they have that we can support? I'm sorry, I didn't mention anyone's name on that, but I can't see it, I'm afraid. So that was a question that's in the chat room. Shall I put that to Nanette, you first?
Yeah, I think there isn't, and it's not clear to me exactly what sort of projects they're talking about beyond the exchange is, and by the way, thank you for the people who appreciate the work we do. But the truth is this is a team effort, and change is a team sport. So this is not a PCX. PCX can have an idea, but if companies like Century Pacific and the like don't get involved, there's really nothing, right? So I think this is, everybody should be patting themselves on the back when they commit to improving on their sustainability commitments. So as far as projects are concerned, there's certainly quite a few EPR bills on the floor in Philippines. So I'm not sure if that's exactly what this person was alluding to. They have taken a backseat during COVID for understandable reasons. I fully expect that, you know, towards the second half of next year that this will again gain traction and the government will look at extended producer responsibility. We hope that by that time, PCX has built a credible enough or a scalable enough infrastructure that we could be considered as a mechanism for compliance, right? To help the government, to help the business community, because we do feel that the degree of transparency and the cost at which we've been able to do this at is very helpful. We also have tools in place where you know, the companies can be accountable to the public, which is quite nice. So these are projects at the exchange. I'm not quite sure if I've answered that question. If I haven't, please feel to reach out offline, and I'd be happy to try and provide better answers.
And I've worked at that question, actually was also from Anna Verona of Clean Our Oceans Project. I just don't understand how to read the chat.
They should join the exchange. The exchange is basically a platform for anybody to join, and you know, whether you are a neighborhood collection program, you know, going out to do beach cleanup, or you're a large organizer or aggregator like Plastic Bank or whatever, they are all welcome on the exchange, because as I said, change is a team sport, and the more, the better. So, you know, come on board.
Michael.
Hi, I think I hung then. Am I back now?
Yep.
Sorry, I was,
yes, you're back.
Everything froze. Sorry about that. It's not normal for Singapore to have such bad connections. It's normally we blame everyone else in the region for having bad connections. So that's, I think I got most of that, Nanette. Thank you so much for that. Giovanna, anything to add there on in terms of movements and things they can get behind other than buying Century Pacific products?
Well, that's step one, always. But no, I think from a regulation standpoint, the Philippines is relatively earlier days, right? But I think the great thing we're seeing now is many major players in the private sector, right, as well as the nonprofit sector, like what Nanette is doing, have made great strides in advance of regulation, right? And so this almost creates some level of, let's call it peer pressure, which pushes a lot of companies and industries forward. So I would say not necessarily regulation per se, but a lot of these, you know, independent organizations, again, either private, public, or NGO, that are sort of bold enough to take that step, to take that lead. And I think that's sort of, I guess, another form of eyes or peer pressure that pushes this country forward. You know? So again, hopefully we see more of that. And yeah, I think we don't need to wait for regulation. In fact, I think Nanette alluded to this earlier already, that it's likely that regulation will follow, right? Once you sort of see a lot of these things happening already.
Excellent. There's actually a second question, similar lines, but I'll ask it anyway. We can address it directly. So this is from Emily Devonport. It says, how do you see credits working in the context of emerging EPR schemes? Are any EPR schemes emerging in the Philippines? I think, Nanette, you did just touch on that. But in terms of credits working in that space, I'm actually going to add a little bit to that, because I'm also intrigued as to whether you think the Philippines government, when they have an EPR scheme in place, will disallow you from selling credits internationally, and just actually allow Philippine companies to buy those credits in the Philippines. But I'd be interested to hear around that subject.
Yeah, so there are many dozens of bills on the floor for EPR. I think they're trying to strike a happy balance between not being anti-poor, right, and at the same time trying to solve the environmental issue. So yes, they are working on these things. I think that, to your question about whether or not they would prohibit us from selling credits globally, I cannot imagine that they would do that. And the reason is because this is money from other markets that would come in, development money that would come into the market that wouldn't otherwise, right? So that's additionality for us. And so I think that it is highly unlikely that they would disallow, people in New York to clean up in Manila Bay. Like that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? So I do think that they will consider, though, the role that credits play, learning from the carbon market. There are a lot of cautionary tales there. We ourselves are trying to navigate those risks because we don't want to make the same mistakes. So issues around traceability, double counting, right? Is it really additionality? A lot of those issues we're trying to address at the exchange. And so we hope that when EPR comes into place, that they will consider at least, and they have, in fairness to the government, they have been consulting with external groups to see how they can craft the best language around EPR. So I have high hopes.
Excellent. Giovanna, anything to add there, or?
No, so I was just going to say, Michael, that Nanette's the expert on this one, so we'll take her word for it.
I suppose to come back to what I was asking, I suppose it's more likely, what you said was very true. So it's so unlikely for the Philippines government to stop money coming in to tackle domestic. It's more likely that, so to use your example, that a New York government would stop people sending money from New York to the Philippines when maybe they could be cleaning the Hudson River instead. Mm.
Yes, that is very true. But if you take a look at this more broadly, and there are countries, I am aware of legislation kind of being circulated in other countries where they would require companies to geolocate their offsets. So yes, there is that risk. However, I think there's been a lot of pushback from the business community for a variety of reasons. One, a lot of companies cross-border their products, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is there is some argument for cost, right? So in the same way that, JP Morgan might have all their outsourcing, here in the Philippines because it's very cost effective. A lot of companies are saying, look, the epicenter of the problem is here, right? Indonesia, China, Philippines, you have that list, right? This is where the epicenter of the problem is. When you're in Australia and you are doing an ocean cleanup, or you are in Hawaii doing a beach cleanup, a lot of times that waste is not from Australia or Hawaii. It's coming in from Indonesia, it's coming from Papua New Guinea, it's coming from the Philippines, right? So if we can almost, if you look at this kind of with the same lens of national security, right, you can say, look, helping other people build their waste infrastructure benefits, not just the planet, but us specifically, in the long run. So I think that there are some voices out there who are advocating to allow kind of cross-border offsets. Now, I will say there is some controversy around offsets plastic offsets that don't exist in the carbon market. So one is, not all plastics are created equal, right? So you've got several different kinds of plastic. And I think a lot of the environmental groups are worried that a company who produces or uses a very difficult to recycle plastic is going to buy an offset, a generic offset that is very easy to process. And so they're not actually apples to apples getting rid of their own, if you want to say, they're not paying the penance on their own sin, right? If you want to look at it that way. So there is some controversy around that. But I think legislators are looking at how they might be able to categorize, right, the footprints and make sure that they offset accordingly. That's a supply chain issue that will be extremely difficult, but I think it can evolve in that direction. The other thing that plastic credits could do, and we're looking at this at the exchange, is allocating a certain amount of the funding to not just do offsets, but to invest in education, right? So you want change, behavior change, but also have a fund that goes into investing in infrastructure, especially in locations where, you know, I mean, just look at the Philippines, the geography, you know, you'll have better infrastructure in Metro Manila, but there are hard to reach islands that have absolutely no infrastructure, right? So kind of being able to help areas that need the infrastructure would be part of our ambitions. And if possible, maybe down the line, we can look at credits to incentivize more expensive technologies. So let's say, for example, you know, there may be some recyclable or highly biodegradable a material that is just too expensive at the moment for companies to use. It could be, and this would be part of the government's job, to look at how credits could subsidize the use of better materials and packaging so that companies are encouraged to actually make the switch away from very problematic plastics, especially you know, sachets or end-of-life plastics, flexibles, you know, that type of thing.
Excellent. Very, very good points. I'm going to ask one last question because Giovanna knows it wouldn't be Albizia Capital if we didn't ask a question that you weren't expecting. So the thing I'd like to ask you, Nanette, is have you made moves towards other countries for actual operations in Southeast Asia? Because I'm seeing in the participants list, I see there's some Thai names, there's an Indonesian name or two, I definitely think there's a Vietnamese name in there as well. So I think we have interest in Southeast Asia, we said already. So we'd love to see this project spread outside of the Philippines to the rest of Southeast Asia. Is there any possibility of that? Any moves?
Yes. So I would like to say to any of those folks, let's take this in steps, right? To using your language earlier. I think as step one, I think you can feel geographically agnostic about your offset and just start, right? Rather than wait for the perfect solution, let's just start. But for any company who is interested to be a founding offset partner in that market, we would be very interested to speak with them. We have been getting a lot of interest, especially from the multinationals, you know, whether it's, you know, Pepsi or Nestle or whoever, who say, you know, great, we love this, but we also would like to do this in these other markets. We're happy to do them in the Philippines today. But, you know, can we also, because they want to cater to the local demands, right? The demands of their local consumers and governments who want to see cleanup in their own neck of the woods. So yes, we are happy to do that. We would be open to exploring kind of country offices with founding offset partners if anybody is interested to go that route.
That's such a strong closer. I'm not going to take, I think we have to leave it there. Please, everyone participating, everyone watching it now, watching it later, contact either myself or Nanette, and we will make sure that you know how to make that further step. I want to say thank you very much to both of you. I think we're just coming up on an hour. I found it fascinating. I think what you're doing is amazing. I wasn't going to mention this, but I was watching another presentation on this conference yesterday, where there was a criticism of the conference of that particular panel, that everyone on the panel looked like me, white European, male.
I was on that one.
Female. This panel, all the people doing the action and actually achieving things are from Southeast Asia and female, and it just shows that if you want something done, thank you very, very much for taking part in this panel. Really appreciate it, and congratulations on what you've done so far. And the very best of luck going forwards with your endeavors.
Congratulations as well to you, Michael, for I think doing a great work from the investor side and pushing a lot of companies like us. We sometimes we don't say it a lot, but we appreciate you pushing us. So congratulations as well.
I've never said that before. That's very true. Thank you very much, both. Thank you very much, Nanette, as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Bye.
Before everybody leaves, I'd like to make another technical announcement. So thank you everyone for attending the Sea of Solutions 2020, and today's session I'm sure is a very informative and fruitful session. There are upcoming sessions as you can see on the screen. So you can also go to the Publio community via the link below to also check other programs or sessions that you'd like to attend, as well as explore other exhibitions and set up meetings with other your fellow conference attendees. And thanks again for your participation, and have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, all the speakers and panelists as well.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.